Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's top 30 best episodes of Bojack Horseman. This video is a part of a series of videos where I've reviewed every episode of Bojack Horseman, one season at a time. I've finished covering all 6 seasons of Bojack Horseman, so now I am here to count down my 30 favorite episodes of Bojack Horseman. So, this, as I said, is part of a series of videos. It's sort of been as a celebration of my coverage of Bojack Horseman, so that's why I'm doing 30 episodes. This video is not meant to be succinct or short or whatever. I'm just here to babble on for as long as I feel like. It's kind of the point. It's part of my celebration of my coverage of Bojack Horseman. Now, if you do want a more succinct, like 10-minute, 5-minute video, I'm sure there's plenty others out there. I do plan on doing one eventually. I have not done one yet as of the recording of this video. But when I do, I'll put a link to it in the description below. So if you want something that's really short and gets right to the point, I'll do like a top 10 that's like 10 minutes or something. But for this video, gonna be however long it's gonna be. That's just the way it is. Anyway, so... first, the big disclaimer I gotta give, this is all my opinion. It should go without saying, but a lot of times it doesn't. This is just my opinion. There's nothing definitive about this. It's not like a collection of opinions. It's just my opinion on what my personal 30 favorite episodes of Bojack Horseman is. Now, one thing I know, this is probably true more of Bojack Horseman than a lot of other shows, is that my opinion does in some cases vary widely from the popular opinion. There are several episodes that are fan favorites that are loved that you will find on most top 10s that are not on my top 30, and that's not an oversight. That's just my opinion. So if you see an episode you're like, oh my god, how can you not put this on here? I forgot about it. Know that I probably don't like that episode, and that's why I don't put it on there. As I said, this is just my opinion. Now, though, if you have seen my coverage of Bojack Horseman, where I covered all 6 seasons, you probably know which episodes I'm referring to because I did talk about them. So the interesting thing about this countdown, and because I've done countdowns like this for a lot of shows that I watch and I review every episode of, like one season at a time. And this is the first time, in fact, this is the first time I've ever done any sort of top episode list where I actually went and watched every episode in order of my list before recording this video. And that's kind of easy to do because these are half-hour episodes. It's not like I have 50 episodes of Next Generation to watch. It would take me forever. And even though I had just watched all these episodes recently, I love the show so much, I actually kind of wanted to watch them again, especially since these are my favorites one. And it was an interesting experience because it was a bit disorientating watching them out of order and out of context, because this show is so linear and depending on what came before it. But also it was, interesting that there's certain episodes I knew I wouldn't have to sit through again because I'm only watching the ones that I really like. So that was the really positive thing of it. But also, I changed the order around a bit after rewatching it because, in this case, I think this is going to be one of the more accurate countdowns as to what my favorites are that I've ever done, because I've actually put together my countdown, but then I put it to the test by rewatching it and say, do I actually like this episode better than the other ones? And sometimes I didn't. Sometimes I moved stuff around. A couple episodes actually ended up moving much higher than I had it originally, and I swapped things around and whatnot. So it made it a very interesting experience. So typically when I do a video like this, I has celebration of covering like every single episode of a season of a show, one season at a time. I'll do a best list and a worst list. I'm not doing a worst list for Bojack Horseman. I mentioned this before. Part of the reason is because I know it would just piss everyone off because a lot of the episodes that would make my worst list would be fan favorites and episodes that everyone loves. Also, I don't really, it would be too hard for me, honestly, to come up with the worst list for BoJack Horseman, unless it was like 5 episodes. If I did any more than that, I'd just be putting a lot of mediocre episodes I think are okay. I honestly don't think this show has that many bad episodes. That's just me. In fact, I'm doing a top 30 of BoJack Horseman, which doing so comprises nearly half the episodes in the entire show. So there's that. But anyway, so as you know, I rate every episode that I review. I give it a rating between 1 and 10, 10 being the best, 1 being the worst. And so I tend to group the episodes in these countdowns together. So I have a little card that flashes up to tell you the number rating of the episode as all the episodes that I'm about to count down. So we'll just go ahead and start with that. So that's right, I am starting with my number 9. Excellent. And I'm starting at number 30, which is, as I said, nearly half of the show. And I'm already starting at 9, which is rare. It actually shows you how much I love the show, because typically when I have shows like this, it's not until at least my top 20 or when I get into the teens that I get into my 9 rated episodes. Now, sometimes maybe I've gotten to 9 at 30 before, but that's in the shows that, like the Star Trek shows that have like over 150 episodes. Like this show only has like between like 70 and 80 episodes, and already like I'm at number 9 when we get to number 30. So it shows you how much I love this show. So anyway, let's get into this. Let's start with my number 30 best episode of BoJack Horseman, and that is That Went Well, the season 3 finale. Now, I don't think this episode was as good or powerful as a follow-up to the death of Sarah Lynn that it could have been, but it was still a good episode. It still did follow up in some ways. I do think that the scenes, the storyline was a bit ridiculous with the, Margot Martindale crashing a boat and spaghetti forming, and it's like, oh no, does anyone have a strainer? And they have Mr. Peanut Butter has to come with his fleet of cars and his strainers. Although I will admit I like the longevity of the joke, which I haven't actually noticed until my recent rewatch, that in the first episode of the season, he talked about how he bought a ridiculous amount of spaghetti strainers and he has no idea why. He's like, surely I'll find some use for them later, and here he actually saves the day with them, which I kind of appreciate, but again, that whole storyline was a tad bit too silly for me. And then he had the scene where Todd tips his waitress $8 million, which I absolutely hated. I thought that was just dumb. As I often say, I'm not a huge fan of Todd. But as I said, the BoJack Horseman storyline in this episode, where he's dealing with the grief of Sarah Lynn's, I wish we got more of actually him going to the funeral and actually reflecting upon it, but they touch on how her death affected him in more subtle ways. And particularly, we get a really good conversation between him and Diane, which were always good. They're always my favorites of the show. And then he eventually tries hooking up with Ethan, doing Ethan around, which I'm actually disappointed that this fell apart. I think that actually would have been really interesting. But of course, it was a really powerful scene where the little girl in that show came up to him and said, I want to be just like you. And he freaked the fuck out. And this, of course, is because it reminded him too much of Sarah Lynn, and the fact that she did become too much like him and ended up becoming a drug addict and hating her life just like he does, and losing her life because of it. So he was freaked out that that he would do the same thing. And so the main reason why this episode made my countdown and made it so high is that ending where he virtually almost kills himself. He was that affected by it. Not just Sarah Lynn's death, but the prospect that he's doomed to repeat it, and he just wanted out of the cycle. And so you see him driving his car, and he starts going like over 100 miles per hour. He closes his eyes and lets go of the steering wheel, and he nearly died, but he stops himself at the last second because he sees a bunch of horses running wild, and that sort of reminds him of what he wants to do, what his life could be. And that's quite powerful. That was a really powerful scene. As I said, there was a bulk of the episode I thought was just kind of okay, but that Bojack storyline, especially that ending, which was really impactful, this makes this episode really good for me. Anyway, we'll move over to my number 29, Stupid Piece of Shit. Now, this is from the fourth season. I kind of like the framing device of this episode where we get inside Bojack's head, where he just keeps calling himself a stupid piece of shit, and we have this weird, funky animation, and he's basically talking himself down of every single thing he does. Sort of gives us a glimpse, insight to his mindset, and yet he still does all this nasty behavior and these bad things regardless. Like, for example, his mother is living with him now, and his daughter, who he thinks is his daughter at this stage, Hollyhock, and whenever he goes out for milk or just to go errands, he just disappears all day, sits on the side of the road, or goes to a bar and gets drunk, and he's abandoning them and being very neglectful, and he keeps calling himself a stupid piece of shit. And also you have the scene, one of my favorite scenes, where they have Bojack Horseman's mother, Beatrice, is attached to this doll, because she has Alzheimer's, so she believes this doll is actually a baby. And apparently this was based off of someone's experience with a parent who with Alzheimer's, that they actually had a doll they thought was the baby. But of course, this is Beatrice, so Bojack has to antagonize her, and he takes the doll and throws it over the cliff of his house, which basically traumatizes her because she thinks it's a baby that he's doing it for. And he had the eternal dialogue of him, calling himself a stupid piece of shit, but at that moment he's like, do it! Which I think is kind of funny. Now, I understand Bojack's mindset. I kind of feel for him in this moment because his mother, who treated him like literal shit, and this is the one thing I think a lot of people need to know, and I've heard a lot of videos and essays that defend Beatrice, which I'm sorry I don't buy, but, to an extent she's a human being, but I still think she's a horrible human being, and I don't care about any excuse to come up with her. But anyway, she has treated him like, she's traumatized him, and this is, I guess, I don't want to get too much into it, but you can get into his mindset, and it doesn't excuse all of his behavior, of course, but it does explain it. And she was a terrible mother. She was an abusive mother. It's not physically, mentally, emotionally, extremely abusive, and really stunted his growth. And so it does make me, regardless of her own abuse that she suffered, it doesn't excuse it. And it makes me kind of lose sympathy for her, and I gain sympathy for Bojack in this moment. Even though he is acting like an ass, that is a huge asshole thing to do, and I don't defend him throwing the doll over the roof, but I can understand it, is what I'm saying. Because she's showing this baby love. It's just a doll, and she's loving and saying, oh, I love you, and yet she never did that to the real life, him, when he was actually a baby. And I can understand that being frustrating. So I appreciate this episode. I think it was a nice little ending where Hollyhock talks about the voice in her head. And she's like, oh, that goes away. That's just a stupid teenage girl thing. And Bojack's like, yeah, sure. When we know through this whole episode, he's been just had that voice and it says it's calling him a stupid piece of shit throughout. So that was an interesting way to close it out. So yeah, this is a pretty good episode. Anyway. Alright, so now we'll get into my number 38, sticking with the theme of Season 4, Loving That Cali Lifestyle. Now, I have to admit that this is one of the episodes that dropped a bit after my rewatch, and I saw this episode wasn't quite as good as I remembered, because this episode dealt with Diane taking down Jessica Biel for liking avocados, which, don't get me wrong, I didn't hate that. That was actually kind of funny. But the whole storyline with Mr. Peanut Butter's trying to get Woodchuck Berkowitz reelected, I wasn't a huge fan of that, and yeah, I don't know. That's just that Jessica Biel thing was okay, but moreover, it dealt with like Todd and his dentist, his clown dentist, which I hated that storyline. As I said, I'm usually not a fan of Todd, and I thought that storyline was really dumb. Although I will say I did appreciate that scene where Princess Carolyn was trying to get Filbert made, and trying to, convince Turtletop, and Todd used his dentist clowns in order to help her. So I thought that was actually kind of a funny scene. But then when they got into the other stuff with the dentist clowns and then having to put on a performance for Yolanda, that was stupid. I didn't care for that at all. But the main thing, of course, that I liked about this episode is the Bojack stuff, because this is when the thing with Hollyhock comes to a head, where she ends up going to the hospital because her Bojack's mother is poisoning her, and her fathers show up and they shut Bojack out of his life, and he's really depressed over it. But then, of course, he discovers that it was his mother who was poisoning her all along, and he loses his shit and goes to take her to a home in order to put her in their worst available room, which actually I found that quite powerful, because I kind of agree with Bojack where his mother pretty much ruined his whole life. As I said, she verbally, emotionally abused him, and now the one connection he had with his daughter, she ruined. Now, granted, she has dementia, and I know some people will feel sympathy for that she wasn't aware of what she was doing. But from Bojack's perspective, I could understand why he would just want to dump her in a dark, dirty room that looked outside at a dumpster. It's not that I agree. It's not that I egg him on or agree or cheer or anything. It is sad and depression, but it is quite powerful stuff. So I did quite enjoy that. So anyway, we'll get into the next episode, which is Brat Brat Pew Pew. And this episode actually jumped a little bit, just a little bit, after watching it. I didn't mention what number this is. What number is this? This is number 27. Yeah, I originally had this at number 30, so it did go up a teeny bit. Because it's funny, I didn't think much of this episode before my rewatch. Then I rewatched it. It's like, hey, this episode's hilarious. But then when I was putting this countdown together and I saw I gave this episode a 9, I'm like, why did I give it a 9? What was so great about it? So it ended up slotting at my bottom. But then I watched it again and I was like, oh, I get what's so good about it. It's funny. It's one of the funnier episodes. A lot of the jokes do really work for me, and of course the main storyline is about it's a funny concept. It's about Diane having her job to tweet for celebrities, and she's talking to Bojack and she tells him, I'm getting an abortion, and she tweets that for the celebrity she's tweeting for, which is Sextina Aquafina. And so first, Sextina Aquafina wants to fire Diane, but then she's becoming really popular and she's trending, and so she uses it and acts like she is having an abortion to the point where she wants to film her having an abortion so they just stage it. And I think the way it just escalates and it just gets more ridiculous. And I just like the jokes that they tell. I think all the jokes land and are really funny. And one of my favorite parts of this episode is at the end, where Diane's at the abortion clinic and she meets another girl who's having an abortion and who's a huge fan of Sextina Aquafina. Diane talks about how disgusting that song, that Brat Brat Pew Pew song, where it says, kill that baby, kill, how disgusting that song is. And the girl's like, it's a joke, it's a metaphor, you get that, don't you? She doesn't actually want to shoot the fetus. It's making light of a very dark situation that makes it a bit more bearable to deal with. And that does show how a lot of people sort of deal interpret art in different ways and deal with it in different ways. Because there's a real life situation where I have people say, well, you do realize it's a blah, blah, blah. Which is like, that's not really what I would think of it at all. In fact, I do actively disagree with that girl, if I'm being honest. And I'm more on Diane's side that it's distasteful. But here's the thing. Diane's completely 100% correct that this is only giving fodder to the pro-life movement. And if a song like that did exist in reality, oh my God, conservatives would jump all over that shit and be like, look, see, they actually want abortions, and see, they admit that it's murder and all this shit. So I actually agree it would be hugely damaging to the pro-choice movement, but that's, just me. It was interesting getting that different mindset on it. And of course, Sextina Aquafina doesn't give a shit about anything. She just wants to make money, and that's another huge thing. So it's interesting. But but the other perspective of that is that she gave hope and really uplifted people who are suffering from that situation and under the stigma of having to have an abortion. So I thought it was a very complex way of looking at it. And the other storyline in this episode I actually thought was hilarious as well, which was what Bojack finding out that his publicist is with George Clooney's, an obvious George Clooney's. In fact, I love later in the series how they'll even say George Clooney. And like, what? I thought it was George Clooney's. And like, nah, forget about that. But anyway, actually at first he doesn't find out. He decides to prank him because he was pissed off because he won an award or some shit. But then he finds out that his publicist, Anna, is with him. And he freaks out. And it's a very funny scene where he's putting on a weird accent. It's like, no, I go to... And he just takes off a mustache and goes, it was me, Bojack Horseman, haha. And his whole thing was that he was going to hit him with the baseball bat. And then everyone's like, that's not a good prank. He's like, that's the whole point. It's not a prank. But George is like, oh, nice one. That was too funny. But then at the end, of course, Anna actually does dump George and the other clients and says, I'm only going to focus on you now, Bojack. And Bojack is like, because all the pressure's on him now and he's starting to freak out. But then, like, she basically, like, molests him, like, grabs him without his permission and then starts, like, squeezing, don't you ever betray me. Like, that was some really dark shit. And this is a really twisted character and a twisted situation. So yeah, it was a notable episode. Anyway, we'll move over to my number 26, The Telescope, which was a notable episode for season 1. I probably don't like this episode as much as a lot of people do, but I do think it was definitely an interesting episode. That's one of my favorite jokes. And where Todd is in the car and Bojack's trying to be all serious and tell the story of Herb. And he's like, oh, let's play a game. And Bojack's like, okay, let's play a game. I spy with my little eye somebody who needs to shut the hell up. I just love that. And of course, you had the flashbacks to the horsing around that tells the story of how Bojack and Herb got together and made the show, and he owes his career to Herb, and he had, like, each time they're in a time period, it plays a generic song, like the generic 90s grunge song, something from Seattle. Like, that was also absolutely hilarious. But then you also have, of course, the touching story of him going to try to reconnect with Herb, and Herb, of course, is like, is an asshole to them, but is like, that knife is still my back from when you stabbed me in the back. But they actually connect, and they have a good evening, even though, Herb hasn't completely forgiven him, but they still sort of just have a nice evening together. And he says it was actually good to see you. But then Bojack ruins it because he wants closure. And this is one of the powerful touchstones of this show, saying that real life is not like sitcoms. You can't always have closure, and this is something season 1 in particular made clear, that Bojack really wants to have as a closure. He sees life as a sitcom, and I love how Herb outright calls him out and says, "I will not forgive you. You do not get to have closure." And then, of course, this leads to a physical fight where they're fighting over the telescope. Diane has to break it up, and Herb just tells him that he's a horrible person. Really powerful shit. And then it ends, of course, with Bojack trying to kiss Diane at the side of the road, which, of course, not a good idea. So, yeah, this actually was a pretty memorable and pretty powerful episode. So, then we get into my number 25, Ancient History. Now, this is the Season 5 episode when Hollyhock returns. This was a really interesting episode that dealt with... I like the Hollyhock and Bojack relationship, and I think here it was really nice because it was really touching. They accepted their brother and sister, and that they really wanted to see each other. And Bojack, it was made clear earlier in the season, was like really wants to connect with Hollyhock and thinks of her as the sister he never had. But, you know, the way Bojack always does, he ruins things. In this case, he is addicted to painkillers. And this is the episode in which we find out he's addicted to painkillers because he's been taking them ever since he got in an accident on set. But Hollyhock had her own trauma from when she was, poisoned by Bojack's mother, where she saw the pills and was triggered and threw them down the sink. So the whole episode was about Bojack trying to get them back. They have these shenanigans. They run into Doctor Who again, where it's who wants to party, and you have that nice line where like, oh yeah, I totally stopped it. I sobered up. Who wouldn't be shaken? What kind of monster wouldn't be shaken by Sarah Lynn's death? And Bojack's like, oh yeah, sure, yeah. Where of course referring to him. And then, of course, they end up running away from the cops, and that very funny scene was like, I'm not a cop, and talking to this lollipop microphone. And they end up running away from the cops, and Bojack climbs the fence, and Hollyhock's like, wait a second, I thought your back hurt. Other shoe drops, Bojack actually not in pain, he's just addicted to the pills. And it's a sad episode, too, because they kind of part on less than ideal terms. Because Hollyhock was dragged from place to place and ended up running away from the police rather than spending time with her brother like she wanted to. And he wouldn't even say I love you to her. And it was quite sad. But she did make him promise not to take pills unless he needed them for pain. And this led to a stupid loophole where he decides to intentionally get himself into a car accident so that he can take painkillers. And that was a very fucking powerful way to end the episode, where you just see him at a traffic light and he's like, and just slams on the accelerator and goes right into traffic. And then they hit you with like a punk rock version of the ending theme song. Which I loved. I thought that was a really great way to end this episode. Now, this did feature this subplot where we get the creation of Henry Fondle, which, I don't hate this storyline. It's not the worst thing ever. I thought it was a little ridiculous, particularly the creation where he created Henry Fondle, a sex robot, for his friend Emily, because he wanted to be with her but didn't want to have sex with her, so he created a robot to have sex with her. I thought they could have done more with the storyline and could have went in a different direction with the way that they did, which I'll actually touch on later. But I do like the joke where Todd's like, oh, I have an idea. How about some marbles that are cubes shaped so they don't roll away? And Emily says, no dice. Get it? Funny joke. Anyway, let's get into my number 24, Thoughts and Prayers. This episode did drop a little bit after I rewatched it, but I still like this episode a lot. So this is the episode where they have that running joke where Princess Caroline's trying to get Courtney Portnoy's film made, Ms. Taken, but it has a lot of violence, and there's a lot of real life, gun shootings that are happening, massacres that are making it not very tangible for them to release this film because it's a lot of bad press around it, and eventually they end up scrapping the whole thing. Now, I do like that commentary, and I like the commentary about the whole thoughts and prayers and how people always use that as an excuse to do nothing about gun violence, and I love how they particularly focused on that, how everyone, Turtle Tub and Princess Caroline, oh, thoughts and prayers, they would just say that as throwaway bullshit. They don't actually give a shit, and they even highlight how, like, oh my god, I can't believe our movie is shot down before it's even making, oh, how tragic, ignoring, of course, all the people who actually died in these gun shootings. But so I did like that commentary part of it. The part of it where they got into the commentary where they wanted to outlaw guns because women were shooting them, and Diane's like, wow, I can't believe American hates women more than it loves guns, and Princess Caroline was like, oh yeah, I don't quite actually agree with that, because there are real life feminist situations where these militias, I want to say in Michigan, try to use that excuse, well, women need to protect themselves and all that, and try to use that excuse to fight gun registration. So I don't think that's actually realistic, personally, because guns went out because guns is what make money, and that's what the politicians care more about, keeping the gun lobbyists happy. So I think it would beat out any feminist concerns, but that's just me. But anyway, I still like this episode a lot. I did like the whole thoughts and prayers things was funny, but moreover, I love the BoJack storyline in this episode with Hollyhock when they first visit Beatrice in the home, and Hollyhock, of course, is looking at her as a loving grandmother, and she kind of needs that mother figure that she never had. And so she kind of latches on to Beatrice, but of course Bojack still has a lot of hate to her and is like being a total asshole, which I do find some scenes funny. But it has my favorite scene, one of my favorite scenes, my favorite jokes in the entire show, is when Bojack decides to put on a play of horsing around because Beatrice recognized Bojack when she watches TV, the horsing around, but doesn't recognize in real life. So it's like, I got a plan. If we put on the play of horsing around, she'll recognize me, and I'll see like hint of recognition on the high in her eyes. So I'll get close to her, hold her hand, look her in the eye, and say, "Fuck you, Mom!" Like, I lost my shit. One of the funniest things ever. So overall, and then of course when they actually put on the play, it doesn't go like that. She doesn't recognize him. She starts freaking out and tries to change the channel with the remote, and someone else at the rest home is like, I never get to watch what I want to watch. Like, it's all funny. So I like that. I do like that. Anyway, let's get into the next episode, my number 23, which is Best Thing That Ever Happened. So this is an interesting season 3 episode. It follows the episode where Princess Caroline totally was trying to get Bojack this big, high movie off of the heels of his, big success with Secretariat, but he would rather do, in fact, it's like the other agents trying to deflect, he would rather do this indie movie with Kelsey because he still feels bad about what he did with her career when he got her fired from Secretariat. But Princess Caroline fucks it up so badly that not only does she not get the big Hollywood movie for him, but she also ruins his chances to get Kelsey's movie. And Kelsey's actually very pissed off with him and says, well, if you don't want to do my movie, why didn't you just say so? So Bojack is understandably not very happy with Princess Caroline, so takes her out to dinner at the restaurant that he owns, and proceeds to fire her. And it's understandable, and it's an interesting turn as far as the relationship goes. In fact, this episode explores the whole Bojack and Princess Carolyn relationship probably better than any other episode, with a lot of the ins and outs and how it's really a codependent relationship, that they're both kind of really dependent on each other, and that she feels the need to sort of mother him. And I think this explores it really well, but by being hilarious. Of course, I love how Bojack, of course, doesn't have the nerve to fire her himself, so he has cards that he reads from, and he's like, stand to leave. Oh wait, I should do that. And he's like, I see that, and then he gets his cards mixed up, and he starts reading jokes. It's like, January gets my globes a warming, and she's like, what is that? So does the joke having to do with your balls warming? Is that how they work? And he's like, I don't know. It's just a really, and of course when he actually just says to her, "You're fired," the waiter who's been running his restaurant thinks he's talking to him, and he's like starts getting all pissed off and I quit and throwing shit around. Bojack's like, wait, I'm not talking about you, and then he eventually just says so many nasty things to him, and it's like, you are despicable. I was like, okay, now you really are fired. And then it gets a bit ridiculous where a random customer all of a sudden is like, you're the waitress now. And she's like, okay, yes. And this is one waiter trying to be a chef, and he sets the whole kitchen on fire. It gets a bit crazy. One of my favorite parts of it, though, is when Princess Carolyn is driving away just to let the whole thing go, and the song on the radio is like, just drive away, just keep on driving, don't go back to that restaurant, Princess Carolyn. She's like, who, what is this song, who's this meant to talk to, who writes songs like this, who is this meant to be for? Like, that's really funny comedy, and it just works. It's a nice way to explore the relationship. So anyway, we'll get now into my number 22, Hank After Dark, getting into season 2. Now, this was a really interesting episode. Of course, it dealt with Diane. It was a big Bill Cosby metaphor where she talks about this famous celebrity who's really well loved and how he's been accused of sexual harassment, and that she gets a lot of shit for bringing this up. And as she has this like whole crusade about it, and again, this tests her and Bojack's relationship, and I like how she keeps insisting to Bojack that he's not on her side, but at the same time she's doing that. Random people walking down the street saying, "You suck, Diane," and Bojack defends her, and it's like, "You shut up," every time, and to show that he is on her side, but that she kind of needs to calm down. Also, it does illustrate how despicable guys like Hank are, Hippopocalypse or whatever he's called, and how a lot of people sort of defend or protect or perpetuate this kind of behavior by defending a guy like that and refusing to believe it's the case. I guess it's probably in the early stages of the Bill Cosby thing before you actually, went to jail for it. But anyway, but that's juxtaposed by the side plot, which is a Todd side plot that I actually like, which is not very many, where Todd switches places with some dictator, and we mostly see the dictator pretending to be Todd, and those scenes were fucking hilarious, where it's like, oh yes, I am normal American kid, and he's interacting with Mr. Peanut Butter, who's completely oblivious. It's like, haha, normal Todd shenanigan, which is hilarious. And then you have the news with the whale guy played by Keith Overman, who's saying, yeah, the Prince of Cordovia said, hooray, I'm a dictator, whatever, where it's obviously Todd. And then of course when Todd finally gets away and he breaks out the Bojack Horseman, is trying to say how there's genocide going on that he participated in, and how there's they could start World War III, or that he said that the mission was a go, that could be missiles launching that could kill like hundreds of thousands of people, And Todd and Bojack and Diane just dismiss him, and Bojack's even like, "Oh, Todd was that Burning Man or whatever," and even Diane is like thinking, "Oh, the stuff going on with Hank and the sexual harassment is way more important than your genocide and hundreds of people dying." And even on the news, they kind of like downplay, oh yeah, there's like a genocide or whatever, but who cares about that? There's sexual harassment charges and this person's being, and it does sort of put things in perspective a bit. It does sort of play off how Americans and a lot of people in Western cultures care more about like celebrity gossip than actual like real life news. Now, granted, cases of sexual harassment is beyond just celebrity gossip, but I mean, the way they were so dismissive about the genocide and hundreds of people dying, yeah, that was funny, and it was actually quite powerful commentary as well. Anyway, we'll get into my number 21, which is It's You, from season 3. Another episode that was actually quite powerful and funny, where Bojack gets nominated for an Oscar. He has this huge party, and Diane. And again, I love any great Diane and Bojack interactions where we get this interaction where she's telling him that this isn't him, that he's just being frivolous, and he's like, you don't know anyone at this party, and it's like, yes I do, I know Tesla, and she's like, you're just looking at the Tesla, and of course he takes the Tesla, he's like, park it in the living room, and he like drives it backwards into the pool. Really classic scene, how he sort of just, and it is about how he felt empty when he found out he was nominated for an Oscar, and he's just trying to act like it's the best thing that ever happened. It's all superficial, and Diane can tell, and she tries to make him aware of it, but of course he doesn't want to hear it. But then, of course, Mr. Peanut Butter shows up, and you get the whole revelation of what actually happened, that he's not really nominated for an Oscar, that Mr. Peanut Butter just made up the nominees, which is, but it's ridiculous. It's a far-fetched scene, but it's actually quite decent as far as Mr. Peanut Butter and Todd scenes go. And of course, Bojack, the way he reacts is like, he tells him, Mr. Peanut, I don't care about your brother. Did you say I wasn't nominated for an Oscar? It does say how much in his head he is. And then, of course, speaking of Todd, one of the most powerful scenes, of course, coming at the end of the episode, where Todd finally tells him that it's like, you can't just keep doing shitty things and thinking that everything's okay because you hate yourself. It's more that you have to actually change, and the problem, it's you. That's paraphrasing. The way he said it was actually much better, but it was actually, quite a powerful episode. So anyway, I will now get into my number 20. Now getting into my top 20. Brand New Couch, which is the premiere episode of season 2. I always really liked this episode, even though it's not one of the more well-loved episodes. In fact, I overall find season 2 a bit underrated. But this episode is hilarious. Of course, what are you doing here? Which I think is hilarious, because this is the episode when Bojack is listening to all these motivational tapes, so he's got this brand new attitude where he's all... Now, I love the contrast between this episode and later in season 6, because season 6 he actually does become a better person. He does make the connections, but it's in a realistic way. It's a natural transition. It's the way you can buy. He is being nicer to Mr. Peanut Butters, but it feels real. It feels like a natural progression of how he would be nice to Mr. Peanut Butters. Where this episode, his transition is entirely artificial. Like, he's just faking it. He's trying to convince himself by listening to these motivational tapes, but it's not an actual transition, which is why he instantly regresses later in this episode. and how he's artificially being nice to Mr. Peanut Butters. I do love that scene where he goes to pick up Diane and Mr. Peanut Butters and him are talking like, "Hey, pal," and they're being all nice to each other, and the whole entire time Diane's like, "What? What's going on? What's happening?" Like, that was a really funny scene. But then, of course, he's so artificially happy that he can't play the scene where he's supposed to be sad and he's supposed to say, "What are you doing here?" in a very sad, somber way, but instead he keeps going, "What are you doing?" Like, I love when Kelsey and Turtle Tub come to his trailer and they were like, and he goes, "What are you doing here?" And like, "That's perfect, say it again." He's like, "What are you doing here?" And he keeps like in a scene where he's like practicing in his trailer trying to say the lines like, "What are you doing here? What are you doing here? What are you doing here?" And then Mr. Peanut Butter comes in and he's like, "What are you doing here?" So he just says it perfectly naturally, but whenever he tries to act, he overreacts, and of course he has this crisis where he thinks he's a bad actor. But another thing about this episode I think is quite powerful is that it really gets into... This is, I think they mentioned it a bit in season 1, but this is the episode that really gets into the trauma he suffered from his mother and just how emotionally abusive she was to him. And we get a couple of flashback scenes where, you know, the one she was went to see his show and she was being completely miserable to him, and we get some scenes with him as a child as well. This shows just how abusive and horrible as a mother she was. And we get that classic scene where they're at the restaurant after having just seen horsing around. And she is like being completely horrible to him at a restaurant. He's like, "Can I get some alcohol? Can I get a bourbon? Can you bring me an alcohol?" And eventually it's like, "Somebody put some alcohol into my mouth." It was a hilarious scene, but also it really gets into the trauma he suffered from his mother. And then, of course, what really breaks him out is of his artificial being a nice, happy guy is when he actually does talk to his mother, who says some really hard-hitting, emotional, abusive shit that really makes him depressed and he reverts exactly to where he was before. But on the upside, he can play the scene perfectly because he really feels miserable now. Anyway, really interesting commentary about how sometimes, like, some people say that they can only give really good performances or make good art when they're depressed. So, not necessarily a good thing, but interesting. Anyway, let's get into a number 19, which is Higher Love, another underrated season 2 episode. In fact, I think this episode is really underrated because I was looking up on IMDb, like the list of episodes has them rated, and this is actually towards the bottom, which I could not fathom. Like, I think this is way better than a lot of episodes that were higher than this. So if you don't remember, Higher Love is the episode where they deal with the funky Spider-Man. I can't remember all the other different terms they had for it, but the autoerotica asphyxiation thing, and it deals with, this is when Corduroy Jackson admits that he was into it, and I think, Mr. Peanut Butter's agent dies from doing it, and so that's why this is where Princess Carolyn becomes his agent because of that. So at the start of this episode, and this deals with Wanda, and I actually like Wanda, who was the owl who Bojack was in a relationship with in season 2. I actually liked her and thought their relationship was more interesting. I should have put more episodes with her in it. But anyway, where Bojack is casually leaving the house, and he goes, "Love ya," and then realizes what he said, and is like, "No, I don't," and then runs off, and then makes it like this huge weird thing. Well, meanwhile, Diane, and Mr. Peanut Butters is like going broke because of all these stupid schemes he's doing with Todd. This is, again, I kind of like the Mr. Peanut Butter and Todd scenes in this episode where they're talking to the accountant. It's like, "Has this ever happened to you before?" It's like, "No, it's not. It's never happened to me. It's never happened to anyone." And what the funny thing about this scene, though, is they talk about how they bought the rights for the movie rights for the game Tag, which couple years later, a movie actually did come out about Tag. So maybe not such a dumb idea after all. But anyway, and that was actually a decent movie, by the way. But anyway, so yeah. Where was it? Oh, yeah, auto asphyxiation. And so Bojack finds out when he's talking to Corduroy Jackson, which is hilarious scenes where he's like, oh, we don't have to talk about how you masturbate. And he's like, all right, well, let's talk about something else. So it's like, okay, I found Jesus. Well, have you let Jesus in your life? And then Bojack's like, so what kind of rope do you use? Which I find is hilarious. But anyway, Corduroy Jackson tells Bojack that he had to stop, and he gives him his kit away because he's like, I can't do it because my girlfriend is really upset with me and says that if I love her that I won't do it anymore. So Bojack gets in his twisted head that he pretends to want to do it, autoerotic asphyxiation, in order for Wanda to admit that that she loves him. And of course, at first when he's talking about all this autoerotic, she's like, what the hell is going on? And eventually he lets it, but if you love me, you'll tell me not to do it. But if you don't love me, you won't care. She's like, oh, I see what this is all about now. And eventually you get scenes where he's like, okay, I'm gonna autoerotic asphyxiate myself now. She's like, okay, have fun with that. Like, those are absolutely hilarious. But then eventually he actually gets it around his neck and starts choking himself, and Wanda finds like, okay, I love you, idiot, stop doing it. I thought it was a nice touch in their relationship, and of course Bojack was being stubborn and not admitting that he loved her, which clearly he did if this was so important to him. Yeah, so I thought it was touching, and then of course it ends with Corduroy Jackson actually dying at the end of the episode. So yeah, I actually really like this episode. I'm surprised it's not higher. I don't know. How can it be towards the bottom? I just don't get that. Anyway, let's get into my number 18. And this is one of the episodes I was referring to that actually started like a lot lower on my list, like towards like 30, but it ended up like just jumping higher and higher and higher. And finally landed at number 18 because I really enjoyed this on the rewatch. So that is BoJack the Feminist from season 5. Again, I think the social commentary in this episode is really powerful, particularly about how no one will listen to feminism unless it comes from a man, and how BoJack doesn't really actually care about feminism, but he pretends to because people like him, and he's getting a lot of attention, and that's all he cares about, which is really consistent with this character. And of course it also deals with Vance Wagner, the Mel Gibson analogy, and how he's like really despicable and does all these crazy over the top despicable things. It's like, I hate Jews, and then he appears later with a Jewish person's like, oh, I'm of the Jewish faith and I support him, man, because he's giving me a role in this movie. And then one time he was like, what did he say? Something like in his answer machine to his daughter where he's berating her. He's like, and I hate the Swedish too. You didn't see that one coming. And then the next time we see him in the press interview, he's with some Alan Skarsgård, or one of those famous Swedish actors. It's just hilarious. But anyway, yeah, it was an over-top episode, but I liked how there was interesting commentary with the fact that Princess Carolyn didn't care about, was against Diane trying to take down Vance Wagner until Vance Wagner quit her show, and then all of a sudden she wanted to help Diane take him down, and she's like, wait a second, you're just doing it because he quit your show. And she's like, oh, wait, don't be so cynical. But it's true. Her reasons were sort of petty and self-motivated. And at the end, Diane talks to Anna, what's-her-face, the publicist, who's Vance Wagner's publicist, and saying how despicable she's being for supporting men like that. But then at the end of the episode, of course, we get the bombshell where Anna plays the tape we got all the way back in season 3 of BoJack confessing to what he did in New Mexico with Penny. And it's kind of putting in, she's like woman to woman. She's like putting in Diane's face that, or you say that I'm supporting disgusting men, but you need to realize you're doing the same thing with BoJack. Which is pretty damn powerful. And sort of put Diane in her place and kind of would inform her character for the rest of the season, which led to some really interesting stuff, which I will get into later on. So, actually did really enjoy that episode. So, let's now move over to my number 17. Another episode that started a lot lower on my list, but kept etching up higher and higher, is Our A Story is a D Story. This is a season 1 episode where, of course, BoJack steals the D from the Hollywood sign, which is why for the rest of the show it's referred to as Hollywoo. Yeah, this is another episode that appeared quite low on the IMDb list, which I was shocked about because I think this is a great episode. For one thing, it is hilarious. I think it is one of the funniest episodes of the show. Particularly how BoJack and Mr. Peanut Butter just keep trying to show off and up themselves for Diane, and Diane doesn't even care about it anymore. And the way that they reveal that BoJack gets really drunk, and the next thing we know, he wakes up and he sees the giant D in his backyard in his pool. And it's just all the jokes about that where something like, I can think it was Diane who was talking about the message she left on her answering machine, saying there was a lot of like sounds of metal scraping and a lot of huffing and puffing, like you were carrying something heavy. And then when Diane tries to get into his house, of course he tries to kick her away. He's like, I'm quite sick, cough, cough. And she's like, you just said cough, cough instead of coughing. And then eventually, like, she's pressing him more and talks about the answering machine. And he's like, oh, can't talk right now, cough, cough, cough. And he runs away. Which that was fucking hilarious. And Mr. Peanut Butter shows up, and BoJack's like, how did you know? It's like, whoa, how did I know? Well, I got my team of investigators, and we put together the clues, and oh yeah, by the way, you left me a message on my answer machine. And he's like, I really gotta stop calling people when I'm drunk. Absolutely hilarious stuff. But then, of course, it ends with Mr. Peanut Butter stealing his thunder, as always, and claiming to take the D as a big romantic gesture. But then Diane actually doesn't like that either, because she doesn't like big romantic gestures, and as overall just not a smart thing to do. It was a hilarious episode. The jokes really worked, and I actually think it played nice on BoJack's character. I guess most people don't like it because they seem to steer away from the whole season 1 thing with BoJack having a crush on Diane. But I actually thought that was a pretty interesting storyline, particularly the way it played out in this episode. But that's just me. Anyway, let's move over to my number 16, The Face of Depression, which is a season 6 episode. This one's a bit more serious. Having to do with BoJack coming back from rehab, and you get all these haunting scenes where he goes back to his house and they see all the flashbacks of all the horrible things he's done, like punching the wall, when he was mad at Gina for taking his pills, and like driving the Tesla backwards in the pool, and all this times where he was drunk or on drugs and told Todd he was an asshole or lazy and shut up, Todd, and stuff like that, and that because he was a changed person now. And then you see him go to the AA meetings where he talks about how he's a different person, and he even sort of reconciles with Sharona because we got their backstory and how he added her, and she is able to forgive him, and he stops dyeing his hair, and then we get the look for the rest of the show where he actually shows his age and has gray hair. But you get the other storyline with Mr. Peanut Butter being the face of depression, which I didn't really care for that. And the whole thing about him trying to get Pickles to sleep with other men, where she slept with like 72 men at this point to try to be equal. Like, that whole thing I thought was pretty dumb. I mean, it's making commentary on how that concept, let's sleep with someone else and get even, is a dumb concept. But the whole Joey Pogo thing and being the face of depression. What is depression? Like, I don't know. Like, I didn't care for that too much. But I do like the scenes because BoJack goes to Diane in Chicago and has us stay. It's probably my favorite part of the whole show, any of the BoJack and Diane scenes, and how she's actually depressed. And BoJack, it's an interesting dynamic to get where BoJack actually feels better about himself and has kind of recovered, but Diane is now depressed, and their sort of interaction, she was hiding it at first. And they have some really nice touching scenes, and he tells her to go live her life, that he'll be okay, something that will come back to haunt him because he's not okay later on. But it was a really touching scene. But I also really love when BoJack reconnects with Mr. Peanut Butters and Washington. Actually, I thought this was the better sort of reconnection of BoJack and Mr. Peanut Butters, where Mr. Peanut Butters finally gets his crossover episode when they get to the museum that has his old set, and it's like, it's a crossover episode. He's so freaked out and so happy, he starts crying, and someone sees him. Look, sad dog. That was funny. I will admit, that was funny. So this was a really, really good episode. Alright, so then we'll get into my number 15, an episode that appears a little bit later in season 6, the Horny Unicorn. So this was a heart-wrenching episode that dealt with the aftermath of BoJack's downfall, his fall from grace, where everyone hates him and despises him because they found out that he basically left Sarah Lynn to die, and he could have been directly responsible for her death for all they know. And had that horrible interview where he came off as an asshole, so everyone hates him, and no one's talking to him, and the only friend he can find is Vance Wagner. Now, I will say, I think they upplayed this a little more, did come up as slightly unrealistic. Particularly the one scene that irks me is when he goes to the AA meeting and everyone's being an asshole to him, because that's the whole point of AA, is to not judge people. And so that whole thing came off as, I understand why Churro would not want to talk to him, because he actually called her out by name in the interview, which is a real asshole thing to do. But the other random people at the AA just treating him like shit, like I thought that was dumb. I didn't buy that. But it was plot convenience so that he could end up as Vance Wagner for a sponsor. And one of the things I love about this episode is the contrast between Vance Wagner and BoJack, because BoJack is a horrible person. He's done a lot of horrible things throughout this show. Particularly, like, the biggest thing that just came to light for us, the audience, was the fact that he left Sarah Lynn for 19 minutes, in which maybe if he'd gotten her help right away, she could have actually survived. We don't know, maybe not, but still, that's a huge deal. And he did that out of fear, out of his own self-protection, trying to save face. But with all the horrible things that BoJack has done, strangling Gina and almost sleeping with Penny and all the other horrible shit he's done, just basically being a horrible person to Todd, like they had the whole chalkboard, which I'll get to shortly. He's not as bad as Vance Wagner. He at least is a kind person at heart, and he does actually care about people. And he's just not always, his self-destructive narcissism and self-loathing often gets in the way. And that's how he actually did overcome that for a while. But this whole thing of being dragged back into the limelight really sort of repressed him. And but he's actually not a bad person at heart, as compared to Vance Wagner, who has no shame, no regret, no guilt. He is that horrible person. And it is interesting that people had forgiven Vance and he was okay at this stage, yet everyone hated BoJack. But as they pointed out, that was kind of fleeting and that people would forget about it, which they did. But still, it showed BoJack at his lowest, and the only people who wanted to hang out with him were asshole frat boys. Who was like, yeah, I get it, man. Fuck and that, and it showed, and of course, the thing that I think is most powerful about this episode is where he tries to contact Holly Hawk throughout the episode, and finally she disconnects her number, and he reads the letter he got from her, and I love that we never actually see what that letter says, that we just get Bojack's reaction, because that's all we need. From Bojack's reaction when he drops the letter and he's horrified, we know what it says. She never wants to see him again. And then he's sitting there and have that in the frat party where they have this flash where the things are going by really fast and somehow a beer ends up in the sand and it cuts to black. Like, that's powerful. That is fucking powerful. Really good stuff. So, anyway, let me move over to my number 14, which I know some people might be shocked or surprised or whatever. That's only number 14 and not number 1 or number 2, as most lists would have it as number 1 or 2 or at least 3, not 14. But if you watch my coverage of Bojack Horseman, you won't be surprised, because I already talked about how I don't think this episode is as brilliant as most people do, but I still, of course, really like it. It lands as high as 14 on my list, and that is Free Churro. Which I do appreciate. I do appreciate the monologue, and watching this episode again did not make me want to drop it lower. I do think it deserves this spot at 14, even if it's not as high as you would like it to be. But because I do think it's a tad bit overrated, if I'm being honest. I think there are much better episodes of BoJack, but it is a really masterfully written dialogue or monologue, I should say. Sorry, correct myself. It's a masterfully written monologue, delivered absolutely amazingly well. The voice acting, of course, was Will Arnett. Totally nailed it, but it was a combination of being so well written and so well performed. And it is a risky thing to do, to have an entire episode just be someone talking about his mother. And I love the metaphors they use, like the ICU and, of course, the whole Free Churro thing. And it starts off with that flashback with, his father being a dickhead to him. It does make me think that they couldn't get the actress who voiced Beatrice for Season 5, because she never appeared in Season 5, not even in this episode. So it does make me think that she wasn't available or something. But regardless, it still works without her. I just don't think it is as groundbreaking or amazing as some people may, but I do think it is a powerful episode. But the ending does bother me. I absolutely can't stand the ending. It does drop a lot for me. I think it was the most predictable, cliche, unfunny ending ever. But I do, and it is a funny episode to wrap, because I do love the sort of charm between Bojack and whoever's playing that piano or the instrument, whatever. It's kind of, some of the humor does work. Particularly, I like that when Bojack's telling jokes about his mother. What's the difference between one's in the thing and the other's in the casket? And eventually, I can't remember exactly what it says, but eventually it's like, one's a thing and the other is a bitch! Talking about his mother. It's like, okay, maybe I went too far. And it shows the kind of angst and anger that he still holds, and the mixed feelings that he has over his mother dying, who he absolutely despises, because she was, as I said, emotionally and verbally abusive. She abused him. It doesn't matter if it wasn't physical. It was just as bad as if it was physical. She was abusive. But it was still his mother, and he still loved her. And having that conflict of the regret and how sad he is that she never changed, that she never actually did show him the love, and now that chance for her to do that is gone. Really powerful the way they portrayed that, just through one big long monologue. But that ending really did suck. I'm sorry. Anyway, still number 14, as I said. It's still a really good episode. So now let me get into my number 13, which is Yes and this season 2 episode, the title of the episode is Deceitful, or it's deceives me into thinking I don't like this episode, because it deals with, of course, Todd going to the improv group and them using it as an analogy for Scientology. Bojack, I'm not talking about Scientology. Let me be clear. I'm talking about improv. Where it's clear they're using it as an analogy for Scientology. They just don't want to be attacked like that, which I loved. That was really clever. But the whole Todd actually being at the improv group and yes ending, I'm just gonna go down in my basement. like, all right, it's kind of funny, but I mostly thought it was stupid and didn't like it. But there are a lot of great things that happen in this episode. As I said, I love the relationship between Bojack and Wanda. And this is where she breaks up with him. You have that really powerful scene where Bojack, she's like, what happened to you, Bojack? And he's like, well, you didn't know me. And you got to know me. Now you hate me. And she says the classic line, it's funny, when you look through life with the rose-colored glasses, all the red flags just look like flags. Really sad. Really powerful stuff. But also, the other thing I absolutely love about this episode is that it deals with when Diane first got back from some made-up country. I can't remember what country she was in. With that guy who was actually just a self-serving asshole who wanted everyone to think he was great just for publicity and didn't actually care about helping people, and how she was depressed over that, and she was depressed over her whole life, and she was just staying with Bojack and getting drunk. And I actually really, really enjoyed it because, of course, Bojack was dealing with his own shit because Secretary movie was becoming a huge farce and his director was an asshole, and then he started purposely being an asshole to Bojack when he told him the movie was shit. And so Bojack didn't want to deal with life either. And and so he was just sitting around with Diane getting drunk all day. I love those scenes. I think, that, as I said, I love the Bojack and Diane stuff, especially when they changed the dynamic. And this was a very interesting dynamic indeed, to have Diane be the one who is a drunk and is hiding out at Bojack's house. And the fact that Wanda really didn't like her there was heavily hinting at how she should just go away, but eventually it led to Bojack and Wanda breaking up. Really powerful stuff. I think it was a really great episode. Really liked it. Anyway, we'll now move over to my number 12. It was nice while it lasted. The final episode of Bojack Horseman, which, I said before, they could have done better as a final episode, but as a final episode, especially as it compares to a lot of shows, it's actually really good, because most shows can't do final episodes very well. It's number 12 on my list of all Bojack Horseman episodes, so obviously I really like this episode a lot. Now, I thought maybe after rewatching I might think it's too high, but I don't. Because, in fact, I was tempted to put it up even higher, but then I was like, no, this is a good spot for it. Because, it's not that funny, but not every episode of Bojack has to be hilarious. Although there were some funny moments, like the whole Hollywood. And I love how they play off. But it's a good final episode because it plays off of plays homage to everything that came in the show. Like, they make references to a lot of earlier episodes, and I like how they sort of called out Mr. Peanut Butters with his reoccurring joke about Erica, and he's like, don't worry, Bojack, I'm not going to leave your side at this reception unless I run into my good friend Erica, who has some wacky adventures that distracts me. But what are the chances of that happening? Cuts to Bojack being alone at the party. Hilarious. That was a really nice way to sort of pay off that running joke. But mainly why I love this episode so much is, he has his conversations with each of the four characters. The one with Mr. Peanut Butter is kind of funny, but as I said, I actually like his resolution with the whole crossover episode they did in Face Depression better than this one. And the thing with Todd, that was okay, the whole hokey pokey, turn yourself around, whatever, that's Todd Shenanigan. As I said, I'm not that huge of a fan of that character anyway. But why I love this episode so much is his conversation with Princess Carolyn and his conversation with Diane, which honestly are the two relationships I think are the most powerful in the show, which is, I think, telling why they saved those two for last. the conversation he had with Princess Carolyn was really touching and sweet. How he talked about the sitcom, imagining that she was having cold feet and he would be the hero to talk her into it, and the way they talked through this scenario, and in doing so, they actually kind of did. Princess Carolyn kind of did bring up some of her fears, and Bojack did kind of allay those fears. And it was really touching the way they did it, and it was really touching the way that it ended with Bojack saying, this horny unicorn thing's going to take off. I might need a good agent. And Princess Carolyn, yeah, I can recommend some people for you. Now, I don't get the impression that means that she's going to come out of his life entirely, but that she's done looking after him, that she is grown beyond that. And it's quite touching. And the whole scene was really touching. Now, the scene with Diane was a bit more, I want to say, adversarial than that. It wasn't as, straight out touching, but it was powerful. And it had a really nice resolution that really stayed true to the nature of the show. And I love how they brought up the fact that Bojack called her right before he was going to kill himself and said, if I go swimming, I guess it's because you don't care. That was fucking, by go swimming, of course he means kill himself, drown himself in the pool. And that she actually did think that he had died for an entire day or something. That was fucking powerful. It's really powerful. And here's the thing about the Diane and Bojack relationship that I love. The why I love watching, why I think is the most compelling aspects of the show, is because they're not saying that she's a perfect character. She is also flawed. That's something to make very clear. But Bojack is flawed in different ways. And she kind of was always like this mentor who always gave him advice. But what strained their relationship is the fact that she is flawed. She's not perfect. She can't always be that guide for him that he wants her to be. And that's really what came through in this conversation. But it was nice. It was actually really touching the way she said thank you and I'm sorry and thank you. That was powerful. But as typical, that's not how their last... And they made it clear this is the last time they would ever talk. But that's not how it would end. It would end with their stereotypical banter, which what the banter was about is not really important, but it's the kind of conversation they always have and shows how much they click. And they just sit there staring at the stars as the ending credits roll. And I love how they really drew out the song playing before they actually cut to black. And them just sitting there in silence while the music was playing. That was perfection. So, yeah, I really do think this episode is that great. All right, so now we got into my best of the best, my 10 rated episodes. As I said, this countdown only has 2 ratings, 9 and 10. So now let's get into the 10, the ones that I think are really great. So we'll start with my number 11, just right outside the top 10, but still rated as a 10. Xerox of a Xerox. Now, this is season 6 episode where Bojack, of course, it's the article was written about him, about the horrible stuff that he did. Sarah Lynn giving her heroin and whatnot, and so Princess Carolyn comes up with a plan for him to save face. So he goes on, does his interview with Brixby, which is the same person who he did an interview after the Gina incident, and so she's kind of like a softball celebrity, talk show host or whatever. And so he gives an interview, and it goes well, and everyone can relate to him. Addicts are saying, starting to relate to how, the problem with being addicted, and addicts can relate to him, and everyone's buying him drinks, and they love him, and it gets to his head. And so convinced by the penguin guy, which I love, he works for the network now. I love the line of dialogue where Bojack's like, I'd be an asshole if I didn't do a second interview. And the penguin guy is like, well, I wasn't going to say it. It's funny. So he lets it get to his head. So he does another interview, and it doesn't go quite as the way he planned, because apparently the Paige Sinclair, the 40s reporter, which I think was a stupid concept, but whatever, she got to Brixby and convinced her to do a hard-hitting interview where Brixby really goes after and attacks Bojack and brings into shit to light, like, as I mentioned, the whole thing about him leaving Sarah Lynn for 19 minutes when that could have saved her life, which is the huge thing she drops, but she drops all this other tidbits, like, him sleeping with the person from his fan club and all this other shit that he's done, like getting Sharon fired and giving Sarah Lynn alcohol and whatnot and all that. And so, as I said, I talked about the next episode already, Horny Unicorn. This ruins his life and everyone hates him now because of it. So, I really like this episode because it doesn't really tell you what to think. It gives you complex scenario, because here's the thing. Nobody is absolutely right or wrong. Everyone just has their opinion or perspective. I don't think that Bojack is the asshole that he thinks that everyone thinks he is by the end of this episode, nor do I think he's the hero that everyone thinks he is partway through this episode, which is what I think the point of the episode is that he's a person. And they said this in another episode I'll get to later, that there are no good guys or bad guys, just guys. This is what a famous Diane quote. I think that comes across in this episode in particular. But one point I do love about this episode is the fact that Bojack does let this go to his head. Because this is in season 6. After he recovered, he became a better person. He was no longer that asshole that he used to be. And in the previous episode, just before this, he was starting to become that asshole again, and Todd pointed it out. But here, after that first interview, he is old Bojack. He has fully become the narcissistic, self-loathing asshole that he used to be, because the biggest drug that really affected him was not any heroin or LSD or alcohol. What really affected him was getting positive attention, becoming in the spotlight, becoming the hero, everyone loving him, his need to be loved, which of course the show's made very clear came from a need because he never got love as a child. And so he desperately wanted from his audience to be this huge star. And this is his huge downfall. And I think that's something the show makes very clear. Especially this whole being depressed over the Oscar thing. And that's what really got to him. When he had that first interview and he got all that attention, he got all those people saying that he loved him, this is when he regressed. And he made the huge mistake. And Princess Carolyn saw it and was begging with him not to do a second interview, because she could see it. She could see that he was regressing and no good was coming. He was tempting fate. He was on top of things. But no, he let his ego get the better of him. And of course, the penguin guy is only concerned about making more money. He doesn't care about Bojack himself. And Bojack but he was saying what Bojack wanted to hear. So Bojack tuned out Princess Carolyn, just listened to him, did that second interview, and it ruined him. And he kind of deserved it, because he should have and Princess Carolyn afterwards even said, look, I told you not to do the second interview, but you didn't listen to me. It was quite powerful. But what I love about this episode is how complex it is, and that it's not black and white, and how just gray this episode is. Because you could say, oh my God, Bojack did all these horrible things. He nearly he could be the reason why Sarah Lynn died, so he deserves this. But Brixby, who's all on her high horse and attacking Bojack, and bringing up all these points. By the way, I don't agree, and I talked about this in other videos, I don't agree with all the points that she made. Like, I think she misinterpreted some things about how he needs to have power over women. I don't think that's what it's about with him. I think it was more about his narcissism and his desire to be loved and his apathy. I don't think his desire for power over women was really the issue with him, but I love how she could interpret it that way. I personally disagree with her, but it's an interesting take. But here's the thing about Brixby, though, and this is, again, why I say I love the complexity of this episode, is that she's just doing this for her own self-interest as well. She's doing this to make more money, because the only reason why she's attacking him the second time and not just doing another softball interview is because Paige Sinclair convinced her that she could lose her job with the advent of social media. She'll no longer be necessary. In order to remain relevant, she needs to do hit pieces like this. She's doing it for her career. She's doing it for money, not for any sort of charity, not because she hates Bojack, not because she thinks Bojack did all these horrible things that he needs to be seen for justice. She is doing this for her own self-interest. And so that's a... but you can make the argument that she should have done this, and she's doing a good thing by bringing these things to light. But then again, it's more complex. And the same thing with Bojack. You could say he's an asshole, he deserves this, but does he really? Because he did all these other things. So it's a really, really complex situation, and I love the play of it. And I love the ending where Bojack knows that his life is going to go to shit. There's nothing he can do about it, so he just spends his last days doing stand-up, which is the one thing he really loved. It reminded him of those days with Herb that he loved. And it's sad. And it's just a really powerful episode. So, let's get into my top 10 now. Top 10 time. 10 rated episodes, top 10. My number 10 favorite episode of Bojack Horseman is The Stopped Show. Now, this is the finale of Season 5 that deals with the aftermath of Bojack choking Gina. And this is a really powerful episode because Bojack starts this episode not knowing what he did. And I love how Princess Carolyn's sort of mothering him and trying to get ahead of this, but trying to protect him at the same time. And eventually he forces her to show him the video, and he's like, how bad could it be? Cut to, it's really bad, but in fact it is. And to see his reaction, has to say, I really gave credit to the animators who really portrayed the look on Bojack's face of how devastated he was, and of course the voice acting by Will Arnett, always top notch. When Princess Carolyn showed him the video, and he's like, I'm really doing that, and this is really... And when he realized what a horrible person he was, and the first thing he wanted to do was go on TV and admit it, but Gene had begged him not to, so he did it not for her. I mean, he didn't reveal what he did. He was doing it for her. If it wasn't for her, he would have done it. In fact, the first thing he did was go to Diane and says, please do a hit piece on me. Please bring all this stuff to light. And she refused to do it because this is where she gives her lines, there's no good guys or bad guys, just guys. And she doesn't really think Bojack's a horrible person. Now, here's the irony of seeing this episode in retrospect, after seeing Season 6, that if Diane did do this hit piece on Bojack where she revealed all the horrible shit he did, then that would have been better for him than how it actually did come to light, because it did come to light later on because of Paige Sinclair or Max, whatever. And they were ruthless with him because they were not friends and they didn't like him, and they revealed shit that he didn't quite want to reveal. But if he actually came clean on his own terms by having Diane do it, it would have been rough for him, but it wouldn't have been quite as rough. So that's kind of ironic watching this episode with that in mind, that Diane actually probably should have done the hit piece. But she refused to because she liked him too much. Instead, convinced him to go into rehab, which again was a really powerful scene, a really powerful way to end the show, to end the season, with him realizing I have a problem and I need help. And of course, it does eventually lead to him getting better, but then it gets worse after that. But still, very powerful stuff. But then you get the side plot with Henry Fondle, where his storyline comes to a head, which, again, I like the commentary about how, I believe this is trying to speak of, what's his face, Harvey Weinstein, and how he was a despicable sex machine, but nobody actually recognized that until later, and once it was pointed out to them, then everyone started. In retrospect, actually, he was quite a horrible person. And kind of using the analogy of a ridiculous, over-the-top analogy of Henry Fondle. But I did find it kind of funny, particularly when Todd was being interviewed, and Todd's like, he's a sex robot. And they're like, you mean that metaphorically, right? And he's like, no. It's just the whole Henry Fondle storyline was maybe a little bit too ridiculous for me, but I did kind of like that. But the whole thing with Todd doing the whole of mice and men thing and having to kill Henry Fondle, it's like they were playing it like it was really sad, but it's a bit ridiculous to be sad. I don't know. So I don't know how I feel about that. But the Bojack stuff was just powerful. I mean, I think this absolutely deserves to be in my top 10. But for the scene alone where he saw the video of what he did to Gina, and then seeing his reaction, having to deal with Gina, where Gina's like, you should be in jail, but I don't want you to be what my whole rest of the life is about. Very powerful stuff. So, anyway, we will now get into my number 9 favorite episode of Bojack Horseman, and that is Sunk Cost and All That. Another season 6 episode. This deals when Bojack first finds out about the reporters reporting on him, and he doesn't know what it's about. He just knows that Charlotte called him from New Mexico and saying, tell these reporters to leave us alone. So he knows that has something to do with Charlotte, but then Diane quickly puts it together that it's not about Charlotte, because reporters, that's not really what a reporter would write a story about. That it's part of a bigger story that's about something else. So they have the whole chalkboards and I love this dynamic of having Bojack, Princess Carolyn, Diane, and Todd together. It's good to see the gang together again, because in most episodes, in the later season, they kind of got away from that group dynamic, and I love how they all sort of bring their different spin to it. Where when Bojack tells a story about Penny and Charlotte, which I think he told part of this to Diane in season 5, but I guess he went into more detail this time, and Princess Carolyn is being like the, manager, the agent type, being like, oh yeah, you didn't do anything, that's not illegal, and you didn't even do it, so there's no story here. But but Diane and Todd are being more like human beings, and like, well, no, actually, that's a really shady story. But then, of course, there's the whole chalkboard thing, when they come up with all these ideas, and they write some of the ridiculous stuff, and a lot of it is references. Like, I didn't realize until just recently that the whole sneezed on Marissa Tomei was referenced like 2 or 3 times earlier in this show, just casual references. But then they showed stuff that were outright in the show, such as stealing Neil McBeal's muffin and stealing the D from Hollywood and stuff like that. But it's interesting that on all that stuff, and there's some other things like ruining Todd's rock opera and pretending to get Radiohead, which is kind of funny. But really, that's not what Hollywood reporters want to write stories about that anyway. And I love how Bojack didn't even mention Sarah Lynn, and how it never even occurred to him the fact that he gave her the heroin and left her there for 19 minutes, that would be a thing. And in retrospect, it's the most obvious thing, because what else would Hollywood reporters want to write about? They would want to write about celebrities. It's the whole thing, celebrity gossip. And if there's a story about him being involved in the death of another celebrity, that would be the biggest thing. But I think it's partially Bojack was in denial about this, and he didn't want to come clean to his friends about it, and he finally did. And Diane didn't want to be a part of it, and Todd also abandoned him. But Princess Carolyn the whole time, we're going to get a part of it. And I love when Diane was like, you guys are, you're jumping out of an airplane. You fell out of an airplane, and I'm trying to get you a parachute and make the landing soft, but you're trying to get back on the plane. It's just not going to happen, which was a pretty powerful analogy. And Bojack, and as I alluded to earlier, Bojack was reverting to his old self, having to deal with this, and Toddy was pointing this out. It's like, this doesn't feel like the new Bojack to me. But you juxtapose this with of course, this is going on after his students just put on the play, and they're doing their after party, and they want Bojack to make a big speech. They keep interrupting and shit, which is kind of a funny thing. But then the scene where Bojack actually goes out and gives his speeches, and it shows that he's in his element, and he actually feels like a better person. He's doing a good thing, but it's all about to go away, and he knows it. And it's really sad, and especially, I love the way this is shot, it's animation, but I love the perspective on this scene with where we see Princess Carolyn. We see it from Princess Carolyn and Diane's perspective, how they're in the room watching him, with the door open, where we don't actually see the students, we just see Bojack giving the speech, and how sad Diane and Princess Carolyn are. Bojack Horseman is pretending to be really happy because he has to make a speech for his students, but they see the tragedy in this, and it makes it a damn powerful scene. So, yeah. Absolutely love this episode. So now, we will get into my number 8. This is a weird contrast tonally to my last episode. And a lot of episodes in my top 10, to be honest. But let's get into my number 8. Let's find out. I think this is, bar none, the funniest episode of the entire show. I get a real kick out of it. I think it's again, season 2 is underrated. It's an underrated season 2 episode. There's some good character moments in this episode too, don't get me wrong. But the humor, I think, is the best that the show has ever done. Now, I love how of course, this has to do with the game show, and I love it's a focused episode. It does have a B plot, but it's all centered around the game show as it airs. Hollywood celebrities, what do they know? Do they know things? Let's find out. And I love the gag how that's the name of the show. But anyway, it's a funny thing because Mr. Peanut Butters is really razzing on Bojack throughout the entire show and being an asshole to him. And I like how during the break he's like, you're kind of actually being a dick. And he's like, oh, we're revving here, ideally. And he's like, I'm not razzing you, you're being a dick. And he's like, whatever, pal. And it shows how, because Mr. Peanut Butter is always shown as a nice guy and well-intentioned, but he's also very oblivious. And of course, this is something they'll play on later in the season, as the seasons go by, that this is a character flaw. That he's not a perfect guy either, even though he's seen as he's always nice and trying to be loving. And you could say that Bojack's the asshole for constantly rejecting him. But the other side of that is he is oblivious. And he is kind of self-centered in that way, that he doesn't see the needs of other people and doesn't see the fact that he is treating his good friend like shit. Now, you could argue he kind of deserves it, but that's another argument to be had whatsoever. But the point is, you get a lot of hilarious scenes, like the whole thing, like the whole concept of the game show. And when he has to write this essay, and Princess Carolyn comes in and tells him this long story. It's like, oh, a lot of people were there. Lisa Loeb, I can't do it, but the whole tongue twister thing where everyone's name kind of rhymes. And she says, but I found out that Mr. Peanut Butters has a tail. And Bojack's like, I feel like that story had a lot of unnecessary bits to it. Just their banter was absolutely great. But I gotta let me stop jerking around here. Let's get to why this episode is so amazing. The ending. Nothing is better than that ending. When Bojack, alright, so early in the episode he meets Daniel Radcliffe, and apparently Daniel Radcliffe wanted to be in the show, and that's why the writers made him a really nice guy, an awesome part, or whatever, and it made everyone love him. Other actors who refused to do the show, they made them fall down a store and fall down a hole and break every bone in their body, which I kind of love that. Writers are vindictive. But anyway, so Daniel Radcliffe meets Bojack. Is like, oh, I'm sorry, I don't remember. I mean, when you're a famous celebrity, and you keep calling him the wrong name, and then he sees some random assistant. It's like, oh, you were the assistant on Ellen. Oh, how is your mother doing? And Bojack's like, ugh. But then at the end of the episode, he has the double or nothing bonus question for charity. He could get $1 million or lose it all, depending on whether or not he gets this question right. And the question was, who plays the titular character in the Harry Potter series? He's like, I don't know. When you're as famous as I am, you meet so many people, and all the names start to blend together. And Daniel Radcliffe is like, really? Seriously, dude? This is for charity. It's like, I want to say Elijah Wood. It's like, Elijah Wood! And the money just falls in the pit and burns, and then cut to black. I seriously laughed for like 2 minutes straight the first time I saw that. That is one of the funniest jokes ever. Now, they have this ridiculous side plot with Todd trying to win the pen from J.D. Salinger, which overall I think is dumb because I don't like Todd. But even in that, there's some funny jokes about how he keeps going to hair and makeup, and they kind of play it off. Has did the How I Met Your Mother joke where, that girl who's won the pen was like, Todd, you are the most evil, blah, blah, blah. And they cut to like him as an old man. That's a typical movie thing where they cut to someone saying, I hate you, and they cut to them actually being in love. But he was actually not in the future. It was just he was in hair and makeup again. So that was funny. And also I love Wanda. Again, I'm a huge fan of Wanda. I love her in this episode, how she's on because she's not familiar with modern technology. She's on the app, and she's like, oh, everyone's losing their tits. Oh, wait a second. I accidentally stumbled on a breast cancer forum. Like, I don't know. So overall, this whole episode just clicked. To me, it's the most smooth. It's one of the most comedic masterpieces. Like, everything just came together. So I do think it's one of the best of the entire show. You do get some character moments, particularly between Bojack and Mr. Peanut Butter's, how he reveals that he does the whole joke about how he knew that Bojack kissed Diane. So, well, let's see. Well, I got friends in the highway patrol, and they had cameras, and oh yeah, by the way, my wife told me. But you get that character moment between Mr. Peanut Butters and Bojack. But they turn it kind of into a joke where the producer, like Wanda, tells him that he has to forgive Bojack live on air to make good television. He comes back like, my producers tell me that I have to forgive Bojack live on the air, but I'm my own dog. I do what I want, so I'm going to forgive Bojack live on the air. But that is more in line with Mr. Peanut Butter's character. But then, of course, they make Mr. Peanut Butter and Bojack kiss, which I forgot that they actually kiss, which is kind of funny. It's a hilarious episode, but again, you do get that sort of connection and the build off of the Bojack and Peanut Butter's relationship. So it has a sound foundation. So I love this episode. Anyway. Let me get into my number 7, Head in the Clouds, which is a season 5 episode. Okay, so there's a couple subplots in this episode. There's, of course, a Henry Fondle. This is when Henry Fondle becomes the CEO. And again, I have a sort of love-hate relationship with the Henry Fondle storyline because it is kind of funny how he goes to the CEO and he's like, I want to be on top of you. And it's like, there's no one on top of me. And how he's oblivious and he becomes the CEO of the whole company, which is like beyond ridiculous. Beyond over the top, but it's still kind of funny. Maybe it just contrasts the other stuff just way too much. But then You also had the storyline with the I believe you had the storyline with the popsicle guys, which I really didn't care for that. I thought that was kind of dumb. Where they said they stole the line and then they're just making all these stupid jokes throughout. Like, I didn't think it was the worst thing ever, but I wasn't that big of a fan of it. But why is this episode rated so high? Then if I didn't really like those two subplots so much, because the main plot fucking killed me. And you may think it's silly to have this episode so high because of one scene, but I think this scene may be my favorite scene in the entire show. I think it's one of the most powerful pieces of television I've ever seen ever. And it's not just the one scene, though. The entire Bojack storyline, this episode, is really good because it really shows that he cares about Gina. That he is actually putting himself aside, that he's not as self-centered as he always is, that he sees that this is good for Gina's career and he genuinely loves her and he genuinely wants to help her, which makes the tragedy of what happens next even more tragic. So it's a great setup in its own. But the scene I'm referring to that really makes this episode, that makes it one of the best episodes ever, and it's, in my opinion, the best Bojack and Diane scene, is when his conversation with Diane after the premiere, where Diane is horrified because Bojack thinks that the show Filbert justifies his behavior and makes it okay, where she wants to make it clear that it's not okay, and he's trying to support her. I'm trying to say that she supported him and she's the one who made him feel like he was okay and that he could do these things. And it's interesting because it's still coming from a place of friendship, but she knows that something's up with him because of the whole New Mexico thing, and she's feeling bad about herself for basically doing what she accused Anna of doing with Vance Wagner, of supporting a toxic masculine figure, someone who is really a horrible person. But she knows that Bojack could be better, but is not. He chooses not to be, and she's horrified at the moment that he feels that she is pushing him, that she's saying it's okay to choose not to be a better person. And they have that conversation where Bojack says that I'm the one who's been hurt the most from the actions of Bojack Horseman. And she gets really upset. She's like, really? You the most? She's like, yeah, me the most. And then she drops the biggest bombshell. Like, I really felt this in my bones when she said this. What about Sarah Lynn? And then his response, of course, don't talk to me about Sarah Lynn. And then she presses him, tells about how she used her when she was weak and had sex with her. And oh my God, it was just, the tension in this scene was just so tangible and so fucking powerful. And the fact that she says that even though you're being an asshole right now, I know you can do better. But he's like, I'm not going to change. Stop trying to change me. It's just really powerful shit. And of course he's addicted to pills at this stage. And after the conversation, it just made him feel like absolute shit. And he takes the pills in order to not feel the pain. So he just drowns on pills and then goes out and kisses Gina in public. It's just powerful shit. It's one of the best dramatic dialogue scenes I have ever seen in any show ever. It is just a fucking masterpiece. Anyway, we will now get into my number 6 best episode of Bojack Horseman, and that is Downer Ending. Now, getting back to season 1, which again, most people aren't a huge fan of season 1, I think this episode is extremely powerful. Well, first of all, I like the fact that this is kind of why I think they should have used Todd for. Instead of being like these stupid shenanigans or whatever, focus on him as like this drug buddy who they all do drugs together, and seeing Sarah Lynn in the mix as well And of course, this is when we meet Doctor Who, and they had the whole joke about Doctor Who. Who's Doctor Who? And it's like, no, I'm Doctor Who. It's like, Dr. Quinn, I'm certainly not Dr. Quinn. Like, and then Sarah Lynn and Todd even say third base, because it's obvious a reference to that. But anyway, I really like the dynamic of Sarah Lynn, Todd, and Bojack doing drugs together and getting all freaked out, and how it gets really sort of experimental and existential, and with all the trippy sequences, which I think really work. But and the whole thing about them doing guns, I gotta mention that, because that's kind of amazing how it shows them from their perspective where they both have guns. One of my funniest jokes, by the way, is when Bojack has a gun and is like, I got you, you got me, it's just my lighter. And he goes to light a cigarette and actually shoots it. So that was one of the funniest thing ever. But anyway, back to the whole thing when Todd and Bojack are like holding machine guns, and that's from their perspective that they're like these badasses like shooting off machine guns. But then it shows them what they really look like, and they're just sitting there with brooms going boom, boom, boom like little kids, which is what it's like to do drugs, really. In your mind, this is your one thing, but in reality, you're actually something totally different. But anyway, the really good thing, the most powerful part of this episode, though, is I think this is when the show really showed that it could be more than just a comedy and have like really impactful, powerful drama, was when Bojack was having the vision of what his life could have been like had he gone with Charlotte to Maine. And this, I think, is really telling for his character, because the fact that he didn't showed how much, because he stayed in LA to do horsing around, and how Charlotte said that LA was like the tar pits, which was also a theme that will actually reappear throughout the show, and how really he feels that he would have been a happier person if he went and lived a normal life and had a daughter with her and lived the family life. And it was really soul-crushing, that scene, especially the way they played it out with them having the happy life, and then them having the daughter and seeing the daughter grow up as a teenager and playing with other boys. Now Bojack was happy, and then Charlotte turns to her and says, like, you know, I really wish you would have chosen this life. And then the alarm comes up and he wakes up. Like, that was soul-crushing. Absolutely soul-crushing. Not to mention one of the funniest moments in the entire show is when the show Bojack, he takes the drugs, and it says 2 days later, and Diane comes in and apologizes and says, "You're right, I shouldn't write the book," and then starts kissing him, but then she explodes, her face explodes, and she turns into a grotesque monster, and then it says, actually, not 2 days later, 2 minutes later, which I love that gag. I think that was absolutely hilarious. And he's like, holy shit, I'm still tripping. Really powerful stuff. And then, of course, it has that really impactful, poignant ending where he goes to Diane and says, tell me I can be better. Please, please, tell me I can be a better person. And it really gets into his mindset. So, yeah, that was great shit. So, now, let's get into my number 5. Getting into my top 5 now. We'll start with my number 5, which did jump a little bit after I saw it. It was always in my top 10, but it's now in my top 5 after rewatching it. Int Sub, or Interior Sub, if you prefer, which is the 5th season episode, which, after rewatching this episode, I realized just how brilliant it is. Now, this, I will have to say, is clearly the most underrated episode of the entire show. This doesn't appear, I haven't seen it appear in any top 10s where it really deserves to be. In IMDb, it's kind of, if I believe, it's kind of like in the middle, which this should be towards the top. This episode, I think, is brilliant. So, and hilarious, by the way. Because it starts with the therapist, and it's really risky to hinge this episode on 2 like unknown characters. And I love how these 2 unknown characters narrating but one's a therapist and the other's a corporate negotiator or whatever, and they can't talk about, they're legally contracted not to talk about their work and people that they know, so they just change the names of everything. So she calls Bojack Horseman Bobo the angsty zebra, and I was losing my shit laughing my ass off when they actually changed the opening credits to say Bobo the angsty zebra and show Bojack as a zebra. That was hilarious shit. But then how everyone's names kept changing. Like the whole Princess Diana, that's fine. The whole Princess Carolyn being a pulsating ball of yearning in the shape of a woman, like that was weird. And the Emperor finger face for Todd was also a bit weird. But I lost my shit when they introduced chocolate hazelnut spread. Mr. Peanut Butter, but he was a brown dog. Like, oh my god, that was fucking hilarious. But more than that, what the episode was actually about was it was poignant and funny at the same time. And to me, that's probably the show BoJack Horseman at its best, where it combines like the humor of Let's Find Out and the powerful drama of some of the episodes I'm about to get into one episode, and you got the great humor but the great drama at the same time. And I think this episode probably does that mix the best, and that's why it's in my top 5. Because on top of that, you really get into BoJack's psyche, how after his mother died, he wants people to console him. He is feeling really vulnerable, but he's too prideful and selfish to admit it. So he makes this whole thing about, oh, my mother died, please don't comfort me. And everyone's like, okay, fine, we won't comfort you. And he's like, no, please. And it's obvious he does want to be comforted. And Diane's getting, of course, pissed off because she just found out the thing from Anna and is already sketchy with him, but his behavior is pissing him off even more. When she's like, well, do you want to talk about your mother? And he's like, no, of course not. I'm obsessed with my mom much. And it's funny, but it also gets into like his psyche. And of course, they juxtapose this with Mr. Peanut Butter chocolate hazelnut spread. He's like, oh, when he finds out, oh, my mom's not dead. She went to a farm. And she's like, dude, your mom's dead. Oh my God, my mother's dead. And then everyone starts consoling him. And it's kind of juxtaposing that because it's saying that is the healthy way to deal with a loved one dying. And everyone responds to that and you could recognize that, where BoJack is in too much self-denial and is too prideful to deal with it the healthy way. And it's a really interesting juxtaposition. And also the way where he sees a therapist, but he doesn't want to think of it as therapy. He calls it his friendship hour. And then when he realizes it's therapy, he quits. And then Diane has just like had enough of them. But when you move beyond that, and then we move beyond the whole frame between the therapist and her wife talking, so we go back to the characters how they really are, and we see that it is really them. You see that that Diane is fed up with BoJack over all his shenanigans and has had enough. And so is one, I think, is one of the most powerful scenes in the whole show is when, because there's a script they're working on, and Flip apparently wrote and sub because he was going to write Subway, but didn't write the whole thing, but they already got a set of the sub because they saw that, and so they needed to do something in the sub, and he had no idea what to do. But Diane eventually wrote something based off of what the tape that Anna played for her about, and played the whole where BoJack comes across an underage girl who kisses him on the USS New Mexico. This was fucking powerful shit because BoJack was reading the lines off of cue cards as they were filming it, and he realized that he knows that Diane wrote it, and he realizes that it sounds, and what he says, what this character says, was exactly what he said on the tape, which is the way BoJack would sound. How can I do, I can't remember the exact line, but it's something BoJack would say. How can I make things right after I've done something so wrong? Something like that. But he looks over at Diane because he knows that she wrote it, and so he kind of gets the feeling that she knows something about New Mexico. and that this is her way of telling him. And a really underhanded, like really asshole-ish thing to do. And the look they give each other after, because they lock eyes, because they both realize, because he realizes that she is calling him out on this, and he's pissed at her for that, but she's pissed at him for all his behavior, and they just lock eyes. That's one of the most powerful moments in the entire show. And I love how Flip asks her, well, where'd you come up with this stuff? And she said, oh, this is just something I heard. I just changed all the names. Which, oh my God. Fucking bravo. That's like, because that ties into, of course, the opening part of the episode where they just changed the therapist and her wife just changed all the names to Bobo, whatever. But they kind of flip it so Diane is using that against Bojack. It's fucking brilliant. I love this episode. I think it is criminally underrated. So, now we will get into my top 4. Now, honestly, if you like, you can consider this top 4 all number 1. This is a 4-way tie for number 1. As I was reviewing these seasons and each episode, for each of these 4 episodes, after I first watched it, I said, this is the best episode of the show. and then I started to realize, fuck, man, how am I going to rank these? Because I all think they're the best episode of the show. So this really honestly is a 4-way tie for best episode of the show. And this is why I love the show so much, because it has these 4 episodes that I think are some of the best story writing I've ever seen anywhere. Any show, regardless, or movie, regardless of if it's animated or not, or if it's comedy or not. Like, these are all powerful shit that really, really got to me. So, let's start with what I had to put as number 4. Escape to LA. Or Escape from LA, sorry. Which is the season 2 episode where Bojack stays with Charlotte and her family. And it's a really interesting episode because it opens, the whole way it opens with Kyle and the kids. And the writers even talked about how they wanted to make this like very different from a typical Bojack show. That it was more like the picturesque sitcom life that Bojack always wanted. And this sort of is a nice callback to the Downer ending where in his mind he had this fantasy about how he would live with Charlotte. So he goes out to seek Charlotte out, finds out that she lives in New Mexico, but then of course finds out she's already married with kids. And his first reaction is when she says Kyle and the kids, he's like, I hope that's your band name. And then he finds them out, but he actually kind of falls in love with them as well. In fact, he even likes Kyle. And they form like this weird relationship where, and she actually wants him in her life too. And asks him to stay. So he ends up staying there for like 2 months. And you get the jokes about how he made an excuse of going there for a boat show. So he buys a boat. And Penny kind of calls him out on this shit. But then it all comes to a head when Bojack, he sees life as a sitcom. So he gets a sitcom-esque idea where he'll be Penny's prom date because she doesn't have one. Which, in real life, everyone's like, why is there a 50-year-old man at our prom? And he's buying alcohol for underage kids and ends up being irresponsible. One of them gets alcohol poisoning. He just drives away in a bender in a hospital. Yeah. So it's not sitcom fantasy, it's real life. And that is shady shit in real life. And then, of course, he goes to Charlotte. And they kiss, and he tells her to run away with her, and of course she doesn't want to. That'll ruin her life. She has a family that she loves, and so she asks Bojack to leave, but Bojack's like, okay, I kiss you, let's forget about all that. I'm not asking you to leave your husband, but just let me stay. Please let me stay, because this is his perfect life. And they really accentuated that and showing that this is what he wants. But she's like, no, I can't have you around anymore. You make me too sad. And so he starts to realize his life is his perfect ideal fantasy is falling apart. And he doesn't want it to leave. And then Then Penny propositions him, goes into, shows up at his boat wanting to get in so that she can sleep with him. And he tells her to go away, but leaves the door open. And in that harrowing scene where Charlotte walks in while the two of them are in bed undressing each other, it's like, fucking hell. I mean, that is fucking powerful shit, the way she's just like, if I ever see you again, I'll fucking kill you. And then you see him going back to LA on his boat, and then the Bojack Horseman theme, the opening theme, plays, because it didn't play at this episode because this episode wasn't about that. His life was totally different. They had the typical sitcom theme song, Kyle and the kids, because it was a picture sitcom. But then that all came crashing down, and he's back to being Bojack, the depressed, self-loathing narcissist Hollywood star. And they have the song, the opening theme song, which is very melancholic on purpose, and that's why they chose it, plays as he goes back to LA and finds Diane is still depressed and drinking at his house. And he's back right into feels right with her. Oh, goddamn. Fucking powerful. So, that easily could be my number one. So let's get to another one that easily could be my number one. It was actually my number 3. The View from Halfway Down. In fact, I had this at number 2, but then I put it at number 3, then I put it at number 2, now it's back to number 3. So you can see how temperamental this all is. Ultimately, I think I have this at number 3 instead of number 2 or 1, because as much as I love the finale, because it did come in at number 12, so I do think highly of it, it did kind of undo this episode. It did kind of damage it a bit, because it showed that Bojack Horseman was still alive, especially the cheap way they did it with the joke, Horseman, or Horseman dead, but then it zooms out, says Headless Horseman franchise dead on arrival. Bojack Horseman is still alive. Like, that was cheap. But here's why I think it undermines it a little bit. Even though I still, as I said, love both of these episodes, I don't like that aspect of how it undermines it, because this is the perfect death scene. This episode deals with him coming to terms with the fact that he's going to die and there's nothing he can do about it. But then he doesn't die, he actually lives, so that kind of undermines a little bit of it, doesn't it? But not all of it. It's just a slight thing that kept this from being number 1. Because this is a fucking amazing episode in every other term possible. Getting the interactions between him and the characters who passed, and knowing that this is a fever dream. And I love how they sort of drop hints, like the creepy eeriness feel throughout this episode is like perfect. The way it reminds me of the Leftovers episode where he goes to the afterlife. In fact, I said that I actually think this episode's better than that. And I think, and as much as if you've seen my reviews of Leftovers, I thought that episode was a masterpiece. So for me to say this is better than that, it's quite a statement indeed. And I think I stand by that. I do. I really do, because seeing these characters of Herb and Beatrice, and you get minor characters too, like Cracker Jack and Corduroy Jackson, and also very important characters like Sarah Lynn, and the mix between Secretariat and Cracker Jack. Not Cracker Jack, I always call him Cracker Jack. Butterscotch, Bojack's father. That was an interesting concept, because he always saw Secretariat as more as a father figure, and so they kind of mixed the two. I like that. That was interesting. And seeing their interactions on how their philosophies on life and what their favorite part of life was, and it gets into their characters while having, it's not like a up your head pretentious philosophical discussion about the death or what's the important thing of life, because it's character based, because it really reveals these inner characters, particularly the important ones like Sarah Lynn and Herb and Beatrice, and their different perspectives on what life was like, and it kind of juxtaposes on what Bojack felt about his life, and he's trying to come to terms, because that's basically all this is. This is all in his head. This is about him coming to terms with his own death. But again, I love the creepy way they sort of insinuate that he's going to die by the fact that all the water tastes like chlorine to show that he's in the pool. And then when he keeps saying, "Oh, I'm going to wake up," until finally Secretary / Butterscotch says to him, "You're just not getting it. Wake up. Come on." And flicks his cigarette, and you see Bojack's, like, the silhouette of Bojack's body drowning in the pool. Like, that's powerful and fucking creepy. Here's the thing about this episode. It really, really is a powerful way to get you to face death and what it's like to have this known win scenario where you know you're going to die and there's nothing you can do about it. Hence the title of the episode. Hence Secretariat's poem, which, my fucking God, that was some powerful shit. I had to watch this poem on YouTube like a couple times after watching this episode, because it is just powerful about the view from halfway down, how the whole time he's playing it off, killing myself was the best thing ever. Oh, I loved it, I loved it, I loved it. Oh, I'm so proud. But then he reveals his actual feelings about what it was like knowing that he was about to die and there was nothing he could do about it. And it's like, I changed my mind. This is not a good idea. Oh my God. Like, that really gets into all the nooks and crannies about dying. And then Sarah Lynn doing her version of Don't Stop Dancing was also really telling, because her whole life, like Bojack's, is all about performance and pleasing everyone else and never herself. And she also came from a really troubled home. And how Bojack, like, he, the way he was like, "Sarah Lynn, I'm so sorry." She's like, no, not now, Bojack. Like, and then her was kind of the figure being like, "Bojack, there's nothing you can do about it. There's no here, this is just some weird place." And how Bojack was freaked out and terrified, and he runs from the tar, which is symbolizing, of course, what LA is. And eventually he remembers calling Diane, and he talks to her on the phone and says, and she's like, "But Bojack, I'm in Chicago. We never had this. Why'd you call me?" And they never really had that conversation. She's like, "I can't save you." And so he comes to terms with the fact that he can't be saved and he's about to die. And so he asked how her day was, because that's what always gave him pleasure. Just simple, casual conversation with Diane, something the finale gets into, which I already talked about. And then he dies. But then, as I said, it's kind of undercut by the fact he doesn't actually die. But it's still fucking powerful. Still powerful. So, yeah, this episode is pretty much a masterpiece. So let me get into my next number one, which is my number two. The Showstopper. I think this episode's a bit underrated. I have seen it on some top 10s, but I've seen other people kind of say, "Oh, it's not that good," which I think is bullshit. I think this episode is, again, a masterpiece. So it gets into I love this sort of, this is one of the most interesting, like, abstract ways to deal with someone who's a drug addict from their perspective, because it shows him, and it also, more than that, because it's more than just about the fact that he's a drug addict. It deals with his sort of, how the drugs kind of just enhance his own sort of paranoid mindset of the fact that he wants everyone to love him, but he constantly feels like everyone's out to get him, and that his life isn't, like, his own sort of self-loathing, that everything's going to be ruined. And so, because, as I said, the previous episode made it clear that he really does care about Gina, and he really does want the best for her, and he really does love her, but he lets his own, in this episode, he has his downfall, he lets his own flaws overcome him. And then he has that, I love how, because the show opens as like the Filbert show, and it shows it has as if the Filbert, but it blends between the what happens in the Filbert show and what happens in Bojack's real life, and it shows how that is blending in his own mind because of the drugs, and that he's starting to become this character. And that's something I think was a binding theme throughout season 5, which is why season 5 is my favorite season of BoJack, about how the character Filbert, playing the character Filbert, was so, like, the way he was written, just coincidentally, was really close to who BoJack is, and how playing him really fucked with his head, and particularly doing drugs and being stoned on the, painkillers, opioids the whole time, didn't help that. In fact, made it much, much worse, where he couldn't differentiate between who Filbert was and who BoJack was. So he was taking on all the most negative parts of the role, and really all the most negative parts of his own character, BoJack's character, was coming out because of this. And also, one thing I gotta mention, I talked about this in sub, and I think actually this is the better example. The show's hilarious. This episode not only is heart-wrenching, powerful, and just amazing drama, it's also hilarious. There's just a lot of great jokes, particularly in the first half of the episode, just really land, and I found myself laughing hysterically at like parts where BoJack was like talking about being all paranoid about how everyone's out to get him. He's saying, "What do they all have in common?" And they have a picture of Common up there, which and the fact he's saying this to the production assistant, who's like, "Okay, everyone's out to get you. Right? Maybe we should go to set." Like, it's actually really funny. But then they had that weird like musical again, the "Don't Stop Dancing," which, as I say, I love both uses of the song. Because it gets into BoJack's whole mindset of how he lived his whole life. He didn't go off with Charlotte and live the family life like he wanted to. He wanted the love and attention from the fans, and he wanted to be loved as a Hollywood star because he never got the love as his parents, and how he drove Sarah Lynn down that same disaster. And so they had played off of Gina, who was into musicals, doing the musical version of the song. And you and your popsicle dancers. And it showed how everything was sort of warping and blending in his mind to the point where he actually strangled Gina on set, which was one of the most harrowing, tragic scenes in any show ever. Particularly the way it really shows like how Flip was so despicable he wanted to keep filming, but Mr. Peanut Butter's finally stepped in and put an end to it, because it's like, wait a second, he's strangling her for real. And I already talked about the next episode where he didn't even realize what he was doing, and the next day he had no memory of this. And that shows how big his drug problem was. And it's tragic because, as I said, it made it clear that he does love her and he does care about her, but it's not only his drug problem, but his own sort of self-loathing and narcissism that got in his way. The drugs just accentuated it. And led to this like huge tragedy where he nearly killed her. And it scarred her emotionally for life, which I like how they did touch upon this in later seasons. So it was absolutely one of the most tragic, most amazing episodes ever. So, now, let me get into my next number one, which is my actual number one, which I actually have rated as number one. But as I said, this is a four-way tie, but this is what made it to the top for me. That's Too Much, Man. And this episode is kind of too much, man. I think it is very appropriately titled. Again, this is another example where it's actually hilarious. It blends the comedy and the drama. And it's kind of sort of, you can tell how I like the mind bending and stuff like that, because there's the downer ending, and then the showstopper, and now this. And I guess, well, I don't know if I call View from Halfway Down mind bending. It is more abstract, but these other three episodes I call more mind bending, where he keeps blacking, and then again it deals with his drug addiction, but I never really saw him being an addict or having a drug problem as being the point of the show. I see his depression and his narcissism and self-loathing is more of the point of the show, and the drugs are kind of just incidental to that. But they kind of do accentuate that. And this episode in particular deals with that, where he goes to Sarah Lynn and they go on this epic bender, which I just love their interaction, particularly when they're doing drugs together. And this episode in particular really shows how they feed off of each other's misery and make each other worse. Like, they become worse people when they're around each other, especially when they do drugs together. And that's very clear. And this episode must admit, it's funny how miserable and horrible they become in this episode, where they're just driving down the road and hitting like people on bicycles, and all this like shit's just happening really fast, where they run over the accountant's son in his playhouse or whatever, and Sarah Lynn's just like, yeah, eat a dick, dumb shit. Like, they're horrible people, but it's actually funny the way that they play it, and how they dress up as Diane and Mr. Peanut Butters, and they come home and like, maybe you guys should sleep it off in their guest room. They're like, the mirror's talking to us, and they just run out and whatever. It's like, but and the whole thing with like Anna and her story about the lifeguard, which was actually kind of poignant story, the fact that Bojack couldn't remember it. He kept going back over and over again, but he kept blacking out. And then they, they follow Penny, which of course is a horrible moment for her, and he does actually make her life worse because he's too obsessed. It shows that his obsession over his past deeds will just make things worse. But I love how like he keeps blacking out. When he blacks out, he keeps following her, and he's like, okay, let me write do not follow Penny, so I'll just write follow Penny on one hand, and then he blacks out, and then he wakes up and it says donut, and then Sarah Lynn's gotta listen to the hand she's eating donuts. I'm sorry, that was hilarious. Also, what was funny was the flashback with what's Cuddly Whiskers, when they're talking about an episode of the Bojack Horseman show that people didn't like. He's like, having our main character take heroin was just too much. And all the disconjointed flashbacks where the thing kept flashing back forward also didn't make sense. There's also, in fact, having a flashback that also takes place years mixed in within the drug use. Like, he's describing this episode, and then he says, and all the fourth wall breaking, people just didn't like that. Like, perfect. But of course, I mean, the drama side was just, I was gonna say as powerful, but more powerful. Simply amazing. Like, because you could feel, again, the love that Bojack has for Sarah Lynn, and how he really felt like he connected to her. And I don't think it was just the drugs talking to him, going, I love you, man. Like, you could feel the sincerity behind that he felt the kinship and connection to her, and how they were in that shitty hotel room while she was winning an Oscar, and she wasn't there. Instead, she was on this 2-month-long bender with Bojack. And so he's like, I'm going to make you happy, so I'm going to take you to the planetarium, because that's where she's been saying she wants to go this whole time. And they have that perfect moment together where Bojack is like, this is what life is really like, right, Sarah Lynn? And she's dead. Like, what? I can't think of any death scene from any movie or show that is more powerful, more tragic than that. I mean, I can think of some that are just as, but not more. I mean, what else can I say about that? That's like one of the most powerful endings of any episode. It really, I cannot watch that episode without like bursting into tears at the end of it. It's just, I mean, what else can I say about it? It is just beyond powerful. And it's tragic, and especially watching this episode, knowing how it ends it starts with Sarah Lynn with all this singing to the dancing birds. Like, it's sad because you know what's happening, that this is her last life, and it's just like, it is so goddamn tragic. But you get into the discussion of whether or not Bojack killed Sarah Lynn. Like, when we find out later on in season 6 about him waiting 19 minutes, definitely not a good thing. But as for going on the bender in the first place, I think to blame Bojack, I don't disagree with those who blame Bojack. To say, oh, Sarah Lynn was recovering and she was fine, but Bojack had to come in and be the negative influence to get her to do drugs again. Which I disagree with that very highly, because when Bojack calls, she's like, and says, do you want to go on an epic bender? She's like, yes! And she rips open alcohol cupboard filled with alcohol and starts downing it, and then reveals that her whole entire house is made out of drugs. Like, the paintings are LSD, and the drywall is just drywall. It's not cocaine. But other things are like drugs and Vicodin, covered Vicodin, yeah. This was going to happen to her regardless of Bojack. Bojack could not exist, or maybe Bojack does exist, he never called her again. She would still have this downfall. It was bound to happen. She was just asking. She was looking for any excuse to go on this bender. Now, you could argue that Bojack did happen to be that excuse, so he is responsible. But if it wasn't him, it would have been something else. Because, come on, she was just waiting for it. She had all the alcohol, her paintings were made of LSD. I know that's comedy, ridiculous stuff. But it was just illustrating the fact that she was a troubled person. And Bojack was a trigger, but this would have happened eventually. And this is something, the next episode, which I talked about at the top of this video, that one deals with the fact that when Bojack says that everyone thought that this was inevitable, and Bojack's like, but it's not inevitable, I triggered it. But I actually do think it's inevitable. That if it wasn't Bojack who triggered it, something else would, because she was obviously looking for any excuse. But maybe it would have ended in death, though. Maybe it wouldn't have been as bad as it was if it wasn't for Bojack. And his own misery was combined with someone else who was miserable to make them both worse. But yet they had that touching connection mixed in the misery. And there's a lot of complex relationships like that, where two people can connect and love each other and be good for each other, but overwhelmingly be bad for each other more so. And yeah, I am speaking from some experience there. So I guess this episode does touch me on a personal level in that regard. And so the tragedy of it really hits me. Yeah, and the writing is simply amazing. In this whole show, just how complex and how much thought is put into it. And just how fucking powerful a comedy about a talking horse can be. Anyway, that's it. That is it for my top 30 best episodes of Bojack Horseman. Thank you so much if you did sit through this super long video of me blabbering on, as I warned you I would do, how much I love this show. 30 out of 76 episodes, I think, are 9 and 10s and are all amazing. Just tells you how much I really do think this is the best animated show of all time, and I will stand by that. So that's it for my top 50 best episodes of Bojack Horseman. Be sure to check out my channel as I cover many more shows like Star Trek, The Expanse, Breaking Bad, and more. And starting next month, now that I've finished covering Bojack, every season of Bojack, every episode of Bojack one season at a time, I will now start my coverage of The Outer Limits. Every episode of The Outer Limits, one season at a time, which is an interesting show, because this will be the first time that I do one of these series of covering every single episode of a show one season at a time, of a show I have not seen every episode of. Now, I quote this sometimes as one of my favorite science fiction shows of all time. So I've been wanting to watch it because there are some great episodes in this show that I love to death, but then there are other episodes I think are kind of shitty. And I've been kind of afraid to watch every episode, worried that there would be more shitty than great episodes. But let's put that to the test. So this will be the first time I'll be watching and reviewing every season of the show, and watching some of these episodes, probably the majority of the episodes, for the first time. So looking forward to that. Anyway, you can check out my channel for that and many more reviews. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that. And thanks a lot for watching.